Imagine standing in a room that appears completely ordinary. 4 walls, a floor beneath you, space around you, a finished environment. At first, it seems total. It seems complete in the way reality usually feels complete. You look around, and because nothing obvious is missing, you assume you are already seeing all there is to see. That assumption is older than science. It sits underneath almost every human instinct. The feeling that what appears is what exists. That if the room looks finished, then the room is finished. That if the whole world is visible, then visibility and reality must be more or less the same thing. But stand there longer. Do not move yet. Just remain inside it. Because after a while, something subtle begins to break. Not in the room, in the certainty you brought into it. The room does not behave like a fixed environment. It behaves like an environment waiting for a condition. At first, nothing changes. Then a door appears. Not because it was built in front of you, not because the room suddenly decided to become larger, and not because you finally noticed what was always obvious. The door appears because something in the room and something in you have entered into alignment. That is the frame of this video. Not that reality is fake, not that reality is a dream, not that consciousness magically invents the universe out of nowhere. Something deeper. The possibility that reality appears in layers, and those layers do not become available all at once. They become available when the observer resonates with them. And if that sounds poetic, good. But it is not merely poetic, because at the center of this video, the Resonant Observer Model is making a precise claim that collapse is not random reduction, but a resonance law, where outcomes are selected according to overlap between the vibrational structure of reality, the coherent state of the observer, and their surrounding environment. That sounds technical, so let me make it human before we make it formal. Go back to the room. You are still standing there. One door has appeared. You walk through it. On the other side is not merely another room. It is another available version of the world. And inside that room, there are other doors. Some remain closed. Some are not visible yet. Some do not exist for you at all. Not because they are absent, but because there is no compatibility between your state and what those doors lead to. This is where the series changes. The previous videos have been circling the mystery from different angles. Consciousness, collapse, perception, frequency, coherence, observation. They were mapping the chamber. This video needs to crack the wall and show the machinery. Because the deeper claim is not just that consciousness matters. The deeper claim is that access matters first. Not everything that exists becomes available for selection. Not every possible world becomes eligible for experience. Not every structure in reality crosses a threshold into a lived world. And that means the old question, why does one outcome happen instead of another, is still not deep enough. The question is this: why does only a tiny fraction of what is possible ever become experience at all? That is the real wound inside quantum theory. Physics became very good at describing possibilities. The wave function evolves. Probability spread. Potential states coexist in mathematical form. The equations are extraordinarily successful at telling you what might happen. But when measurement occurs, only one outcome becomes real to experience. And that transition from many possibilities to one lived world is where the foundations begin to shake. This video states this directly. Quantum mechanics predicts probabilities, but does not explain why a specific reality emerges. That gap has usually been narrated in familiar ways. One interpretation says measurement simply causes collapse. Another says every outcome happens in branching worlds. Another says environmental decoherence explains why one classical-looking outcome remains. But we are pressing on the part that all of those leave particularly unresolved. Why this? Why this world? Why this version? Why this admissible reality? And even that can be sharpened further. Because perhaps the observer is not important because it watches. Perhaps the observer is important because it excludes. That is one of the deepest language shifts in this whole video. The observer is not just the final pair of eyes at the end of the chain. The observer may be part of the filtering architecture that determines what can make it through the chain in the first place. That would mean reality is not simply being looked at, it is being tuned into accessibility. And once that enters the frame, ordinary perception starts to collapse under its own arrogance. Human beings trust sight as if sight were reality itself, but vision is already a reduction. What the eye translates into color is only a narrow band of electromagnetic information, a tiny visible interval within a spectrum that stretches from waves smaller than atoms to waves longer than cities. Everything outside that interval is still here, still active, still structuring temperature, radiation, charge, signal, and matter itself. It simply never becomes color, never becomes image, never becomes sight. Reality is not missing outside vision, your access is. And that is on a side note. That is the logic of the entire video. Because if one of your most trusted senses already turns out to be a severe translation layer rather than a complete contact point, then perception can no longer be treated as evidence of fullness. It becomes evidence of filtering. The same logic applies to sound. What you call silence is not the absence of vibration. It is the absence of frequencies your body can translate into audible form. The same logic applies to the brain. Your nervous system does not present the whole field. It compresses, reduces, discards, then stabilizes. What you experience as a world may not be the whole world appearing cleanly. It may be what survived biological filtering long enough to become livable. And this is exactly where the Resonant Observer Model begins to matter. Because the model takes the idea of observation and makes it more precise. Instead of treating the observer as a vague conscious witness, it proposes that awareness has a spectrum, a coherence profile, and that collapse depends on overlap between that profile and the vibrational structure of possible states. That is not just a new opinion, it is a new architecture. It means the room is not revealing everything because everything is not yet resonantly available. It means doors are not opening because they were theoretically hidden. They are opening because access itself is conditional. This is the sentence that starts to separate video 10 from the previous 9. Reality may not be hidden. It may be mostly untranslated. Sit with that. Because if that sentence is true, then the world you call reality may already be a narrow, biologically permitted slice of a much larger field. Not false, not imaginary, not meaningless, real, but radically incomplete. A stable extraction, a negotiated reduction. And if that is the case, then the question stops being, is there more out there? Of course there is more out there. The real question becomes, what determines which part of more is allowed to become a world? That is where we have to go next. Because if the room only reveals doors when the observer resonates with them, then we need to ask what resonance actually is. What is the observer doing in the tuning, and why some versions of reality become available while others remain structurally absent. Not absent from the universe, absent from you. If the room only reveals doors when you can enter them, then the next question isn't philosophical, it's mechanical. What in you decides which doors exist? Because at this point, something should feel off. If reality only appears where there is access, then access is not passive, it is structured. And the Resonant Observer Model is trying to define that structure. Not in terms of belief, not in terms of perception alone, but in terms of frequency, coherence, and overlap. At the smallest measurable scales, everything behaves as vibration. Not as a metaphor, as a physical condition. Quantum fields fluctuate, energy oscillates. Particles are not fixed objects, they are stable patterns of excitation. Even in string-based models of reality, what we call matter is not primarily solid. It is a mode, a frequency pattern, a way something vibrates. So before we even reach perception, reality is already behaving like a spectrum of possible oscillations. And that changes the question, because if everything exists as vibration, then interaction is not guaranteed. Two systems only interact when there is compatibility. When frequencies align, they couple. They exchange energy, they stabilize into something measurable. When they don't, they pass through each other, unseen, unresolved, effectively absent from experience. That is the first part of the mechanism. Not everything that exists is capable of interacting with everything else. Now bring the observer into that. The model does not treat the observer as a neutral point of awareness. It treats the observer as a system with its own spectral structure. Your brain is not just thinking, it is oscillating. Different cognitive states have different frequency signatures. Focus is not the same as distraction. Clarity is not the same as stress. Presence is not the same as fragmentation. Those are not just feelings, they are different configurations of signal. And that matters, because it determines what you can stabilize. But the brain is not the whole system. The video introduces something more precise, a dual architecture. The brain refines, the heart stabilizes. One sharpens the signal, the other determines if that signal can hold long enough to become a world. Without precision, everything dissolves into noise. Without coherence, nothing stabilizes into experience. And that is where the idea shifts from interesting to structural. Because now the observer is no longer just looking. The observer is tuning. Not consciously in the way most people imagine, but structurally. Through state, through coherence, through alignment. This is what the model calls the observer spectrum. Not everything in reality is available to you. Only the portion that overlaps with your internal state. Which means something very specific. You are not selecting from a complete set of possibilities. You are only ever exposed to a subset of possibilities that match you. And this is where most interpretations of reality break. Because they all assume something similar. That all possibilities exist, and one is chosen. But what if that isn't what's happening? What if most possibilities never even make it into the selection process? Not because they are unlikely, but because they are incompatible. This is where the collapse mechanism in the model becomes precise. Collapse is not a random reduction or a conscious decision. It is a resonance condition. Reality resolves when three things overlap: the vibrational structure of what exists, the coherent state of the observer, the stability of the environment. If that overlap is strong enough, a world stabilizes. If it isn't, it doesn't become real to you. That's the mechanism. Not everything becomes reality, only what can hold. And now the room starts to make sense. The doors were never created. They were always part of the larger structure. But they only became visible when the system observing them becomes compatible. So when you walk through a door, you are not entering something new. You are entering something you can finally sustain. And that reframes everything, because it means the limitation is not outside you. It is built into the interface, into perception, into biology, into the way awareness stabilizes experience, which leads to a more uncomfortable conclusion. You don't just fail to see everything, you may be structurally prevented from accessing most of it. Not because it is hidden, but because you do not resonate with it. And if that's true, then the room is not expanding as you move. It is revealing what was already there, under conditions you are only now meeting. So the question changes again, not what exists in reality, but what am I capable of becoming compatible with? Because whatever the answer is to that, that is the boundary of the world you will ever experience. If what you experience only stabilizes where there is resonance, then the room was never just a room. It was a system that does not reveal itself all at once, but in layers. And those layers are not separated by distance, they are separated by compatibility. This is where the idea of dimensions starts to change, because most people imagine dimensions as places, higher levels, other worlds, somewhere else you could go if you traveled far enough. But that may not be what a dimension is. A dimension is not a location. It may be a degree of access. Go back to the room. At first you saw one version of it, one layout, one structure, one stable environment, but then a door appeared. Not because the room expanded, but because your access did. Now imagine that same room, not as a single space, but as every possible version of that space. Every arrangement, every outcome, every configuration of what it could become. Not one reality, but a field of realities. That is a closer way to think about what people call the fourth dimension. Not time in the way it is usually simplified, but the space of possible states behind what you see. The room you are in is one stabilized version of a much larger structure of potential, and you don't move through all of it. You collapse into one path through it, because only certain states are compatible with you. So the fourth dimension is not something you step into. It is something you are already inside of, without having access to most of it. Now take it one step further. If the fourth dimension is a field of possibilities, then what happens when those possibilities begin to branch? When every possible version of the room contains further possibilities, which themselves contain more, and more, and more. Not just many worlds, but a structure where possibility itself is generative, where every resolved state opens new paths, and every path leads to further divergence. That is a closer way to approach what people refer to as the fifth dimension. Not a place, but the architecture of how possibilities unfold from possibilities. A branching system, a recursive field, where reality is not static, but continuously expanding through what becomes accessible. And this is where the door model stops being metaphorical, because every door you encounter is not just a different outcome, it is a different branch of compatibility, a different alignment between what exists, what you are, and what can be stabilized between the two. We're not walking into new worlds, you are entering new alignments, which means something very specific. The number of realities that exist is not the same as the number of realities you can experience, because existence does not guarantee access, and access does not guarantee stability. So when you stand in the room and you only see a few doors, that is not because the rest do not exist, it is because they are not available to you. And that reframes the universe completely, because it means the structure of reality is not just defined by what is there, it is defined by what can be entered. Now bring this back to everything we've built. Matter vibrates. Reality exists as a spectrum of possible states. The observer has a coherent structure. Collapse happens where there is overlap, which means reality is not revealed, it is admitted. Only certain configurations pass through the threshold and become experience, and everything else remains outside that threshold. Not gone, not unreal, unresolved. So when you think about your life, your decisions, your path through the world, you're not just moving through space, you are moving through a field of possibilities where most of what exists never appears, Not because it isn't there, but because you never became compatible with it. And this is the part that changes the meaning of everything. You are not standing inside a complete universe, choosing what to look at. You are participating in a system that determines what is allowed to become real to you. Through states, through coherence, through resonance. The room was never empty, it was saturated with possibility. But only a fraction of it could ever stabilize into something you could enter. And that fraction is what you have been calling reality. So the question is no longer what is real. The question is, what am I capable of accessing? Because whatever the answer is to that is the boundary of the world you will ever experience. Reality doesn't reveal everything that exists. It reveals what you are able to enter.